My father's been a huge influence in my life. As I said, he's a philosopher logician. He's 90 years old, living a couple of blocks away from here. But I grew up with these yellow legal pads full of logic symbols. And he actually came to my nursery school and created a logic board and taught us, on, off, and, not, or, if, and, or, nots. So I learned that at like 5 years old at Peninsula Nursery School in Stanford when he was in a PhD program. Lo and behold, I sort of followed math and logic. It's like I wanted to know what were those symbols on those yellow pads of paper that were around the house my whole life. Eventually, I ended up at Boston University in a joint program in math and computer science, though at that time, this was 1980, they didn't really have a computer science major per se. And I thought I was going in abstract algebra, like as far as I could go into the math and the symbols. And then at some point I wanted to be a little bit more practical, and I wanted to see how I could apply it to things. So I actually didn't finish a PhD, so that makes me a bit of an anomaly at ISI, in particular in a leadership research position without a PhD. But I did a joint degree in math and computer science and stopped at my master's degree. And I was in a graduate seminar, and we were reading journals and magazines, and we read a journal article on proving programs correct. And I read it, and I just knew in that moment that's what I wanted to do. It was those math symbols, it was logic, it was proving things correct. I want things to be right. I want things to be right in the world. And I just picked up that journal and said, this is what I want to do. I have to do this, right? It was written by a team at the MITRE Corporation in Bedford, Massachusetts, which was just down the road from Boston University. And more serendipity, my then fiance, his best friend worked at MITRE. And so I went to Dan, we had Sunday night dinner at Dan's house, and I said, who are these people? How do I work at MITRE? And he said, I don't know who they are. I work in a totally different area, but there's a career night next week. Why don't you come? I walked into the career night holding the journal, saying, who are these people? I want to do this. And at that time, computer security and the application of proving programs correct, this was 1981, was a very, very small field. Very, very small field. The work was largely being done at the National Security Agency, who of course needed programs to be secure and correct. And so the people at MITRE said, oh my God, you want to do this? We'll hire you on the spot, essentially. And to truth be told, they made me an offer in January. I didn't finish my degree till May. They called me and gave me 3 raises before I started in May. And then I started in May, and I was at the MITRE Corporation, I think about 7 or 8 years. And I actually helped prove correct one of the first secure operating systems. The Honeywell SCOMP operating system was developed for use in Department of Defense and intelligence agencies, and I was part of a team that proved every single line of the 20,000 line operating system to be correct. But I was naive and young and optimistic and thought I could change the world by proving every program correct. You can't do that. I mean, look at the millions of lines of code in Windows or any product out there. And so I sort of shifted my research a little bit more towards how do we develop secure systems and what are the right ways to build systems that can be secure. The other thing I have to say is I immediately got very involved in volunteer opportunities in the community, working in conferences and in computer society and those things from very, very early days. And so I knew it was a 200-person community. I knew everybody working in computer security just about anywhere in the country and some internationally. So when it was time for me to look for a job, I called TIS. I said, you have an office in LA? I'd like to come. So I joined Trusted Information Systems and quickly became a research director there and basically managed the LA office and quite a lot of the work that we did. Very similar to what I currently do at ISI. So I've stayed in the same venue of research funding from Defense Department primarily for my entire career. So I think one of the things that was very interesting about Trusted Information Systems is it was a small company, very family-oriented. It was headquartered in Maryland, but I was part of the Los Angeles office and eventually ran the Los Angeles office. Trusted Information Systems had the opportunity in the 90s to invent the first internet firewall, which is a fundamental part of cybersecurity still today in everything we do, that we have to have this perimeter defense. It's not the only defense anymore. We know perimeter is not sufficient, but it was very, very fundamental. And that company went through huge growing pains, and then we had an IPO. During the time that that company went public, I decided to get my executive MBA because there was a lot of business going on that really people needed to understand. And we were a bunch of geeks, right, that were building this internet firewall. So I did an executive MBA at UCLA at that time. And it was very interesting because the professors would talk about valuations and public offerings and all of those things that are associated with it. And then I'd go and live it as part of the initial public offering. So that was a very big learning period for me. And a couple of years after we went public, we were acquired by what was at that time Network Associates, McAfee Computer. A lot of people know who McAfee is. It's a virus company, and we were acquired by them primarily for our firewall. Little did they know when they bought us that we had a 120-person research arm. We had that product, and we had some people that sold it, but we had a 120-person research arm. And everyone above me in the acquisition went off with millions and millions of dollars. So there's a really key thing about doing the kind of research we do, which is it doesn't cost you any money. It's all cost reimbursable. So I've taken my MBA, I understand business, I understood spreadsheets. In fact, when they came to interview us at Trusted Information Systems headquarters, they went around the table and asked myself and my peers, what's your backlog, what's your average run rate, what's your spend rate? I remember the guy sitting next to me poking me and saying, Terry, what's my backlog? What's my spend rate? And I knew all the numbers for the entire division. So I just spit out all the numbers, and then I interviewed with their CFO, spit out all the numbers, and then told them this story that they didn't understand. When you do government-funded research, you build into the money you charge the government enough money to pay back your rent, your telephone, it's your overhead rate. So cybersecurity in the 80s and even well into the 90s was still primarily of interest to intelligence agencies. I was still doing a lot of work for the National Security Agency, still doing a lot of work for DARPA, for different parts of the Defense Department. And the rest of the computing world was all about how do we move from big pieces of iron kinds of computers, DEC PDP-11s, those kinds of computers that took up whole rooms. How do we move those to personal laptops, to small servers? I mean, nowadays we have servers everywhere, right? So the big movement was really more about availability, form factor, open use to everybody. The internet was just being invented in terms of now how do we connect them together and how do we send messages. So I think that's a really important factor in my career, is that initially internet and cybersecurity weren't really in the same space, right? The internet is open and we're all here and we're all part of a community and we need to share information. Even then in my work for places like NSA and evaluating the security of systems, our challenge technically was now we're going to connect them together. And so is the connection of two secure devices secure? In fact, there's a fundamental research result that says it's not, and it can't be. So that was the conundrum that we were all working on in my community, right? Then when Trusted Information Systems was, then in the 90s is when Trusted Information Systems invented the first internet firewall. And that's a fun story, but it's not directly my story, except I was in the leadership of this company, which is when President Clinton took office, he said, I want to get on the internet. I want whitehouse.gov. Whitehouse.gov didn't exist at that time. He said, I want to make the White House accessible to the people. Clinton went to DARPA, who was funding Trusted Information Systems in a number of different ways, and said, President wants to get on the internet. What can you guys do about it? And we were very lucky to have some very smart people who had already been working sort of in this area, and we invented the first internet firewall. We called it the Firewall Toolkit. And we ran it at TIS headquarters in rural Maryland. and tested it out for quite a number of months. And men in black suits with little wires in their ears would show up and say, bad thing happened to whitehouse.gov. How did that happen? And we'd have to fix it and make it work, right? And we had these long-haired hackers and and then we actually took the firewall and we installed it in the White House and did a lot of that back and forth in it. And then we finished that project and we went to DARPA and we said, so what do we do with this? And they said, well, DARPA-funded research is all open source, so you should open source it. Put it out on the internet. We're talking about the internet. Let people download it and use it. And we started having some uptake and some interest in it. And then some very large international corporations, Shell Oil's one I remember, came to us and said, we want that internet firewall thing, but we don't want an open source thing. We need it managed and maintained and upgraded and all of that. And so, we sat there in rural Maryland and said, how do we do that, right? Is it a service? You charge them monthly? Is it a product? Is it a turnkey product? All those things I was studying in my MBA program. And we ended up being very successful in how we managed and sold that kit. It was a different part of the Trusted Information Systems group that was really focused on the firewall, while I was in the 120-person research organization, focused really on doing more research, looking 3 to 5 years out, and starting to talk about these internet security problems is really where I was. And that was a first and a big cultural shift and change, because Trusted Information System, as I said, was this very family-oriented company. And all of a sudden, we're in this huge corporation. That company bought 32 companies in the year they bought us in a quest for the secure device. So now they were going to take all their antivirus, all their firewall, all their hardware security, everything, and create the magic box that you put in front of everybody's computers that would make everybody secure. Again, many sort of naive paths that computer security has gone down through the years of trying to solve the problem. The primary security problems in the 80s that the government was interested in at that time really revolved around confidentiality of data or information. So we often talk about cybersecurity as confidentiality, integrity, and authorization. Who has authorization to do it? How do we maintain the integrity, and what's the confidentiality? So the government agencies I was working about, especially something like NSA, how do we make sure that the data doesn't leak out? How would information leak out that, at, say, the White House, from whitehouse.gov, this was in the 90s, right, that would, break national security in some way, right? And so really a lot of it at that time had to do with access controls. And so if we mark the memo top secret, how do we make sure that a process in a computer or a human using a computer, duly authorized even human using the computer, can't access something that's top secret? So a lot of it really was about information flow across the different security levels that the nation works from. Of course, hackers have always been around, but early on, hacking was really about viruses and corruption of information. And at that time, the government was less interested in the corruption and more interested in maintaining the confidentiality of it, which is what led to firewalls and perimeter defense. And we believed that we could create a moat around the castle and protect all the crown jewels in the castle from security and cyber attack. We quickly learned that was no longer going to work and that we had to assume a stance that we would be attacked. And then we moved towards being able to have resilient systems or recoverable systems and different ways of detecting attack, not just preventing attack. One of the last things I did at Trusted Information Systems is I had some work funded by the Department of Defense, and they asked me, they said, well, denial of service is a new kind of an attack, right? So we've gone from confidentiality and barriers to now we're having this denial of service attack. And they said, how would you prove that you have a new denial of service solution that would work, right? How are you going to do that? That's a very hard thing to do. So we wrote a fundamental study on a test bed for denial of service. And that really began my journey in cyber experimentation and test. At the same time, things were not going well with my research organization and McAfee trying to make a profit in the dot-com boom, bust era, and so we divested. I reached out to ISI because I knew people at ISI, and I live here in LA. I've been here a long time, and I had been commuting to Santa Clara to go to the McAfee headquarters. So I reached out to the folks down the street and said, would you be interested in hiring me? Is there a job for me? I've had a couple of different positions at ISI. I first actually started working directly for Herb Shore and doing some strategic initiatives. I had that Deter project, but I was doing strategic initiatives and looking at trying to build more cross-division research projects and also more cross-collaborations with the computer science department and others on campus. I actually have a joint appointment with the Marshall School in business with my MBA, and I had done some work with them early on. And then the networking and cyber, at that time it was called the Networks Division, Division 7, at the time numbers were a big way we referred to people, went through some changes and the division director left. And they hired John Raklowski to be the division director and asked me to be his deputy. And he and I were sort of, CEO and COO. John managed up and out and had brilliant ideas, and I managed the day-to-day operations of the division, all the budgets, all the financing, all the staffing, all the people. And we were a great team for about 15 years. We worked together. So one of the very exciting things about joining the Networks Division and taking over a leadership role in the Networks Division at ISI is that division has a very long history in the internet. We really, truly were part of the founding of the internet. And one of the things that ISI is very famous for is we were part of the creation of what's called the domain name system. So John Postel was at ISI and was at that time the head of the internet division. And as the internet was being built out and all of these connections were going across the country, and MIT and UCLA, places that were the ones that first sent messages across the internet across the country, as that evolved and grew, there became a need for knowing what are the places in the internet? How do I reach isi.edu? What does that mean? So Paul Makapetris, working with John Postel and the IETF, created this notion of the domain name system that maps an internet digital number to a name, like isi.edu. And so consequently, there are 13 authorized name servers that run the entire internet. The way the internet works is whenever you go online and you type something in, how am I going to get to UberEats.com, right? Really important place to be, right? What happens is the internet has to go to one of 13 places. Actually, it simultaneously goes to multiple places and asks a question, where does UberEats.com live? And UberEats.com has a number associated with it. And so there are 13 places to have that translation done, and we at ISI run one of those 13 places that does that translation for you. And it's fundamental to the operation of the internet and to our society and making sure you get your Uber Eats. What happens if one of the nodes go down? How dependent are we on exactly those 13 operating all the time? There are outages, and so that is why they back each other up. So it's not like just because you live in LA, you're just going to the one that I run here in Marina Del Rey. Your request for UberEats.com is broadcast to a bunch of different places. Who can tell me how to get to UberEats.com? And sort of the first one that answers it and sends your message to the right place is the one that does that. So we back each other up. There's a lot of redundancy in it. And we do a lot of work in these committees to make sure that we understand what the redundancies are and what the security vulnerabilities are to make sure that the internet doesn't go down. At this point in my career, I really love committee work. I'm very dedicated to providing service and giving back to the community in a way. So I sit on a number of committees with professional societies like the IEEE, the Computer Society, where we look at policies and procedures a lot. I sit on a number of government committees, so I'm on an advisory committee for the National Science Foundation. I sit on advisory panels and review panels in government funding agencies, and then I serve on several commercial boards of directors. I think giving back and being of service is extremely important. And part of my MBA is not just all those spreadsheets, but it's organizational behavior. And service is part of being part of an organization. What keeps me up at night? You would think as a seasoned cybersecurity professional that I would tell you about the threats and the vulnerabilities that are out there, and there certainly are many of those. I have many colleagues that are up at night worrying about that, and I have a lot of confidence in them. I think the biggest threats that we all worry about is catastrophic failure. So I just told you how the root servers and the internet is resilient and won't go down, but I think catastrophic failure. I think, as you probably know, ISI does a tremendous amount of work about information disinformation, fake news, fake images. I think these are really the cutting edge of what's going to change our society and why it's so important that ISI is working in that. So those would be the research topics that that keep me up at night. And sort of it goes all the way back, right? Remember I said that this initial naivete, I could prove it all correct, then we could build a moat around it and it could all be secure, and now need to be resilient. We're continuing on that journey, and we haven't solved the problem. And so one of the things we haven't talked about is my particular research, which is cybersecurity experimentation and test. And here's the thing. The bad guys have the entire world as a test bed, right? They can try out their attacks, their disinformation, whatever they're doing, to their heart's content, largely undetected. Nobody knows that they're trying out an attack on you. You might notice something a little funny, but you don't know that you're being attacked, right? The good guys, we don't have the ability to do that. We can't go deploy a new firewall or a new antivirus thing and attack it in the real internet and see what happens. But the work that my team has done is we've created a cybersecurity experimentation test bed. So we create infrastructure that can model at scale and complexity what the real internet looks like, and allow researchers to bring new cybersecurity solutions that detect or prevent attacks and try them out in a scientific way. Repeatedly, they can do a hypothesis and they can do a test, and then they can change their hypothesis and do another test and get the data that shows the strength of their solutions that they're working on. And this, I believe, is a huge shift in helping, because really, truly what happens, and I've spent time in industry, right, is, you build something, you test it out in some test conditions that you can put together in your lab with whatever you've got, and then you go public and you go to Silicon Valley and you start selling it. And there are many, many good solutions out there. I'm not, downplaying them anyway. But this is being able to look at it from a research and a science point of view. And I'm back. I'm not proving things correct in mathematical logic anymore, but I'm giving researchers a platform for demonstrating the strength of their solutions. Computing has changed dramatically, right? And now computing is every single part of our life in everything that we do. And that hasn't gone unnoticed by the bad guys. And so really, we need to be looking at completely different models of what we're doing. So now it's your toaster and your refrigerator, and it's large societal infrastructure like the pipelines, like the meat packing plants, like ransomware in hospitals, right? These are a different kind of a threat than anything that we've been trying to protect against in these other technologies that we've done, on the one hand. On the other hand, what I like to say to these people when they start worrying about this kind of a large-scale threat, at the very base core, it's still some bits, it's still some ones and zeros operating on a computer or across an internet. So our fundamental notions of cybersecurity still apply, but we need to now bring them up and look at them in what we call edge computing. And we need to look at them in a multidiscipline point of view. I am involved in working on a symposium we're putting together, which is the future of computing research. Computing research is no longer narrowly defined in computer science, but it must involve all of these other areas. And so when we talk about IoT and we talk about ransomware and we talk about pipelines and all of that, we need to bring in business methods. We need to bring in supply chain concerns. We need to bring in a whole nother layer of how much do we trust the hardware that we put together. And if you look at some of the work at ISI at the hardware level, and then even at the microprocessor level, what are the trust characteristics there? So these are huge, huge threats. But at the same time, I actually think that the good guys might be getting a little bit ahead on some of those areas, because the bad guys need to infiltrate at a much different scale. They need to infiltrate at the supply chain. They need to infiltrate at the microprocessor design level to be able to do some of those things. Now, I mean, there are plenty of things that we hear about in the news, and I think ransomware is one that's particularly bothersome, but protections against ransomware technologically are not entirely deep. There's ways to correct it. I love working at ISI. It's just a passionate place. I get up and do what I do every day, and even if I won the lottery tomorrow, I'd still get up and do what I do. First off is it's an opportunity to work with some of the smartest people I've ever been around. You know, arguably some of the smartest people in these areas doing the most leading edge work that we could possibly do. And so that's very, very fulfilling. The thing that's unique about ISI and that makes it so important is if you look across the community, the country, there are academic research universities, top tier universities. There are companies, there are a lot of startup companies, there's large corporations, and there are engineering firms. And we sort of blend a bit of all of that. You know, what I say to my customers is, if you go to a top university and give them a funding grant, what you'll get is one professor, part-time, because he's doing other things, and a couple of students. And they will do some phenomenal fundamental research, and they'll write some groundbreaking papers, and will maybe hopefully graduate some PhD students if they don't get stolen away too soon, right? And that's really a good investment of government money. It's what we should be doing, right? But if you come to ISI, we have people who have longevity. We have a mix of people, which is that top professor, those great graduate students, but we also have great engineers. And we build things and deploy them. And that's what makes us such a great place to work. And as a researcher, what do I want? I want to see my research have an effect. I want to see it be used. Of course, as researchers, I want to get the award-winning paper. I want to be in running for the Nobel Prize or the Fields Prize, right? But really, when it comes down to it, for me, it's like, does it affect something? Does it change something? And ISI gives me a platform to do all of those things. And that's unique.